Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to this event this evening on behalf of the Bar Human Rights Committee, the Protection of International Human Rights, a Barrister's Role. I am Grainne Mellon. I'm a barrister in Garden Court Chambers, and I'll be chairing the event this evening. I'm one of the vice chairs, the co-vice chairs of the Bar Human Rights Committee. And just before we begin, I just wanted to mention some housekeeping, just to mention this event is being recorded, so we will be able to share it with those who haven't been able to join us this evening. And also that we welcome your questions at any stage throughout the discussion. And if you do have anything that you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen, and we'll be collating all of the questions, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can at the end, so when we've heard from all four of our speakers. So we're delighted to see so many of you here this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see this level of interest in international human rights work. Just before you all joined us, we were discussing how popular this event has been, and really a discussion about the ways in which the bar and barristers can protect and promote international human rights is particularly timely. We at the Bar Human Rights Committee have really noticed, particularly in the last year, all of the various ways in which the international human rights framework and foundation is being increasingly challenged, in particular by nationalist and authoritarian regimes. So this is a timely and important discussion, and thank you for joining us. Quickly, by way of background about the Bar Human Rights Committee, for any of you who don't know about us, we are the international human rights arm of the Bar of England and Wales. We are completely independent, and our concerns and values relate to the protection of the rights of advocates, judges and human rights defenders, in particularly around the world, except in this jurisdiction, namely England and Wales. We provide training, resources and guidance to support the development of human rights protections around the world. It includes awareness raising through trial observations and fact-finding missions, and we also intervene in human rights cases by submitting amicus curiae briefs in both domestic and international courts, and we submit letters of concern to government officials in various jurisdictions. We are also a membership organisation, which means that we are based around the membership of mainly barristers in England and Wales, and also some law students. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end when it comes to ways in which you can join and support us as an organisation. But I wanted just to give you a few examples of the types of work we've been doing just this year, and particularly when I mentioned the challenges that we have experienced and which you will all have observed in relation to the challenges to the rule of law globally. One of the projects I wanted to mention is that we've been working on state accountability for severe ill treatment and abuse of the Uyghur population in China. We produced and launched a very detailed report on serious violations of international human rights and criminal law against that population. We've also been involved in confronting the rule of law crisis in Hong Kong, which many of you will have followed the deteriorating situation there, in particular since the 2019 extradition bill. We have been working with local lawyers and academics on a series of statements and reports and letters and contributing to advocacy in that area. We have also been monitoring freedom of expression and the rule of law in Turkey. And in particular, we have attended a number of trials as international trial observers and produced reports on violations contained within those trials and in respect of the trials process. And last but not least, just to give a flavour of what we've been doing, before lockdown, which feels so long ago now, we also travelled to Kazakhstan to deliver training to a group of young lawyers on behalf of the British Embassy in Kazakhstan. So I hope that gives you just a flavour, as I've said, of the type of work that we do, the variety of work that we do, and it might be a useful way of framing our discussion about the ways in which you can work in international human rights and more generally protect and promote international human rights in your role as a barrister. So without too much of a further ado, I do want to introduce our very esteemed and experienced and altogether wonderful panel who have joined us this evening, and we're going to hear from each of them about their own particular career paths and experiences working in international human human rights. Firstly, we're going to hear from Tatiana Eatwell, who is a barrister in Doughty Street Chambers. She specialises in public international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. She started out as a criminal defence barrister before embarking on a PhD in public international law and redirecting her practice from domestic to international law. She's appeared in the UK Supreme Court and has given evidence to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Her work in particular of late is concentrated on arbitrary detention and extrajudicial killings, in particular of journalists in armed conflict. So we're really happy to have Tatiana here with us. Secondly, we're going to hear from Nina Tavakoli, who is a barrister in Red Lion Chambers. Nina, again, started out in a very different area of law. She began her career as a commercial litigation solicitor, transferred to the bar, and now specialises in international criminal law. She has worked with the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and is currently working on documentation and investigation of torture against perpetrated by the Sri Lankan and Myanmar governments. Thirdly, we're joined by Monica Ferrara Tinter, who is a leading public international law specialist at the bar with 20 years of experience in international dispute resolution. She practices from 20 Essex Street Chambers. Her practice covers the full spectrum of public international law areas, and she appears before all of the international courts as well as the English courts. Before she came to the bar, she was a legal advisor to a state delegation negotiating the Rome Statute, and she also worked in the ICJ. Her recent practice includes a wide variety of PIL cases, including in relation to the environment, mass surveillance, enforced disappearances, and genocide. And last but very much not least, we're joined by Rupert Skilbeck, who has an extensive career in litigation. He's currently the director of Redress, which many of you will know seeks justice for survivors of torture. Before that, he was the litigation director at the Open Society Justice Initiative in New York, I think, where he oversaw strategic human rights litigation. He has also worked again in many of the international hybrid criminal tribunals, and before this, practice at the bar from 36 Bedford Row from 1995 to 2004, and was also, I'm sure much to his delight, a member of the BHRC Executive Committee. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. We're really excited to hear from you. And I think without further ado, we'll start with you, Tatiana.
Okay, and thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. It's a pleasure. So I thought I would just, in terms of what I'm going to talk about, just talk about my path to the bar and my experience in the early stages of practice and my transfer from criminal defence work to international work, and then talk a bit about what my practice is like today and what potentially my top tip would be. But I say it with a huge caveat that this is my experience, and I don't think there's any right way to go about it. And what you will see, I hope this evening, is from the panel, is that there are many different ways to work in international human rights law. And so without further ado, I will let you know that I did not start as a lawyer in terms of career. I did anthropology and politics at university, and I very much had in mind becoming a documentary filmmaker, and I worked in documentary film for a few years before coming to realise that it wasn't for me. And I was always interested in human rights, and I wanted to work more in human rights, but with film. And with that in mind, I went to volunteer at Amnesty International for some time with a view to doing human rights-based documentary filmmaking. And I quickly came to realise that what really interested me was the law, and I really wanted to know about the law. So that's why I converted to do law. But I maintained my connection with Amnesty International throughout my studies when I was doing my conversion course in my bar school. And really, to be frank, I have maintained my connection with voluntary work throughout my training and my career as a barrister. And that is one of the key things, I think, to remember or to note about practicing in international human rights law, is that quite often it is very much the best work and the most interesting work is pro bono work. And that's not to say it's bad or anything. It's a real privilege to work on these cases. But that has very much been, I would say, an identifying feature of international human rights work, specifically at the bar in the UK. So in terms of law school, before coming to the bar, I worked as an intern in Malawi with the Centre for Capital Punishment Studies, representing people who experienced prolonged periods of pre-trial detention and who are on death row in Malawi. And I also volunteered, I became a member of the Bar Human Rights Committee, and after that worked on a project to do with Malawi and to do with Palestine. And this was very much in order to advance my interest in human rights and my knowledge, but it's also demonstrating an interest and an attempt to set me apart from others who would also want to be going to those human rights and civil liberties chambers that I was looking to apply for pupillage for. So I was lucky. I didn't find it easy to get pupillage. I didn't get it first time. I got it, I think, second time. And during my wait, that's when I went to Malawi and I set up my own project in Malawi as well. And then I went to work for a refugee organisation in Kenya. And that experience was, I think, invaluable. And I still carry those contacts with me in my practice with people I met in the NGO world there and lawyers in Malawi and Kenya. And I still work with them today. But I quite understand for all of those who are doing the bar now or looking for pupillage, that the focus can very much be on getting pupillage, come what may, and that was very much my focus. But I was very lucky to go to a civil liberties sector called TUCS, and I did a pupillage in criminal defence work, or criminal law. So my early years of practice were in criminal law, and I very quickly came to realise that that wasn't for me. And I think one of my key points to make here tonight is I think it's very important at early stages to think about what you want your everyday to be like in practice. With criminal defence work, you are most days in trial, in court, and if you're not, you're preparing for the next case. And for me, that didn't suit me so well. It was an incredible experience in what people like to term cutting your teeth in court and advocacy. But it doesn't give you much room to breathe in order to develop a practice in another area of law. And for me, the way in which I transferred across was actually through academia. I came to law a little late. I was already in my 30s, and many people were suggesting internships in The Hague. But I took the view that I didn't want to do that, and I went into academia for a bit and did a PhD. I'm not saying again that this is the right way to go about it. It's just my experience, and it was very much my own personal experience. At the time I was starting family as well, and so it was very much a consideration of taking a sabbatical out of practice for a few years and using those years in a constructive way, not only to bring up children, but to transfer my practice into the area I wanted it to be. And I've been incredibly lucky. My PhD was in public international law and state responsibility. And throughout the duration of that time, I maintained a connection with the bar and with practice. And we're very lucky to have Rupert on the panel today. And I was working with Redress during that time on some really interesting work. And that enabled me, when I came out the other side, to really have a basis of springboard upon which to launch my practice in international human rights law. In terms of challenges, I mentioned that lots of international human rights law is pro bono. And that is one of the challenges if you want to practice in this area. Human rights law is an umbrella term. It feeds into many areas of practice in domestic law, in criminal law, public law, inquests, inquiries, extradition. And so I think what what I didn't do at the beginning was think about how I wanted to earn my daily bread. And I think that's a really important consideration, is how are you going to earn your daily bread? What do you want your day-to-day look like? What do you want the substance of your practice to look like? And how is that going to enable you to do really interesting international human rights work that isn't always paid, but gets you those really interesting cases? So my practice now is mainly advisory work, and I do a lot of, with the Bar Human Rights Committee, I've done lots of report writing, interesting reports writing with respect to the Uyghur in China, currently working on a project concerning the Yazidi, and it's through the Bar Human Rights Committee really that I am developing my practice. And then as an individual as well, working on cases with NGOs like Redress that are also pro bono work, but extremely important and take you into areas of international law that you might not have considered. So top tip: think about what your what do you want your everyday to be like. And I think we've got a great mix on the panel of people who from all different areas of practice of international human rights law can really demonstrate the different ways in which it can be practiced. And which bit of domestic law or international law are you really interested in other than international human rights? And how can you pursue that area and build your practice in that so that they complement each other? That's me.
Thank you, Tatiana. That was brilliant. A really interesting and informative overview of all of the options that you faced and the choices that you made. If you have any questions for Tatiana or anything that comes up, please ask them in the Q&A box and we'll come to them at the end. But for now, I think we're next going to hear from Nina.
Thank you very much. And thanks again for inviting me to speak on this panel. So I have spent the majority of my career in international human rights as a solicitor. I qualified as a commercial litigation solicitor at Hogan Lovells in 2001 and didn't cross-qualify to the bar until 2014. With hindsight, for any of those of you who are law students, if you really want to go to the bar, I say go for it. I didn't go for it because I thought it was for people who were dissimilar to me. I thought you had to have gone to a private school to go to Oxbridge. It wasn't very easy to get to. It wasn't advertised particularly well. And of course, it wasn't paid. Whereas the city seemed, in a way, more egalitarian. There was a very clear application process. If you were bright enough, you could make it in. They gave you a grant to cover your law school and also to train. So to some extent, for me, it was a no-brainer. But it also gave me my first experiences in international law because of the fantastic pro bono department that Hogan Lovells has and still has. And many of these city firms have similarly brilliant pro bono departments. And as Tatiana said, pro bono work is really a big part of any international human rights lawyer's work. And for example, cases that I got involved in whilst a trainee and then as a commercial litigator, including petitioning UN special rapporteurs. I worked on death penalty cases. I also volunteered on Liberty's phone line. And then in my own time, I volunteered at a legal advice centre set up originally by Helena Kennedy QC in Waterloo. So I started to develop, despite the fact that I was a commercial litigator, I started to develop an interest in international human rights and also, more importantly, build up my CV so that I could effect a change once I had the money to do that. And then, in fact, I don't know if Rupert remembers, but then my next break was coming out to Bosnia because the head of the pro bono department knew Rupert and she said, go to the defence office in Bosnia. So when I left Lovells, I went there for a month and it was my first taste of being on the ground and I absolutely loved it. And I thought, this is for me. When I was there, I in fact got advice from Rupert's deputy and he said, don't bother going to do your masters. I had a place at the LSE to do a public international law masters. He goes, stay here. The court is just starting. You'll get a good job and you'll be off. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. This is all new to me. I had my place, so I went back to London and I did it. I'm really glad I did that, because actually, in terms of UN jobs, you do need masters to advance up into the system. And also, I met some really interesting people who'd worked in defence offices across the globe. So that was also interesting for me to get a flavour. Then I spent a year applying and getting rejected. That is also part of this journey. I spent a year, I moved back to my parents to save money. I spent a year applying to God knows how many jobs in Geneva in the Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights and not getting any. I found out later that in fact you need fluent French to be in Geneva, and I had intermediate French, and I was very British about my language ability, which I've also learned one must not do when you're competing against Americans. I didn't get anything. I then went to Albania because randomly a girl on my master's said that her friend was a nun in Caritas working on human trafficking. So I got on a plane, I went there, and I spent 3 months in a smoke-filled coffee drinking office with the minister and her team. But it was invaluable again, because I met everyone working in the field. I went to the drinks on a Friday night, and I started to get a real flavour that this was for me. I then thought, right, this is not working, so what am I going to do? And I saw a job in Arusha in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. I had never wanted to practice in criminal law. It was my weakest subject on my conversion course, but I thought, let's go for it. And I went for it and I got it, and that was the start. And now I specialise in international criminal law. I had a fantastic 4 years working for judges, including the president and vice president, working on multiple genocide trials of senior government ministers, of military commanders, and so on, and living in Tanzania. I then transitioned from that to being a prosecutor, the Special Court for Sierra Leone on the Charles Taylor case, and then was offered a job in Cambodia, but decided to cross-qualify. And that, I think, is my second tip. Depending on what area you decide that you want to qualify in, you must get experience on the ground. This is not a practice that can be started, continued and ended in London. You have to go, you have to meet people. It's a very small field. Everybody at some point knows each other, depending on which branch you are in. I'm talking about international criminal law, and you've got to get in there. And so it's invaluable experience. So that's my next piece of advice. Of course, that depends on your finances. The UN is plagued by unpaid internships and finance, which are problematic. And if you have the money, of course, you can do those. If you don't, maybe wait. Do what I did, work in another, as a solicitor, save your money so that then you can go and do this, or do it alongside what you're doing. If you are practicing in another area of law, then just start to try and volunteer domestically on the side as much as you're able. But it's critical that you get that kind of experience. I then returned home, and I had to some extent reinvent myself again. My primary practice had been international criminal law, and the appetite for international criminal trials has somewhat decreased. The international community has put its faith into the ICC, which tries a limited number of cases. So the trend has moved towards investigation and documentation of crimes. So I moved with that trend, and now I document for a NGO investigating historic and ongoing torture in Sri Lanka against Tamils. I've also become a member of the UK government's independent team of experts on sexual violence in conflict, and I deployed to Bangladesh on the Rohingya situation. I've done various projects in the Western Balkans, throughout Africa in that capacity. I've also continued, as Tatiana said, my pro bono work, which, as she also said, provides some of the most interesting work, and it's in that capacity that I represented Bangladeshi NGOs in the Rohingya case at the ICC. We helped them draft an amicus curiae. So I think, to conclude, it's never too late to move across. I think if you want to do it, you can do it. You just simply need to start building a CV and evidencing that you're really serious, because everybody says they want to do this work, but are you really serious? Can you start getting that experience? Spend some time on the ground, and you'll have to do a lot of pro bono work to get there. And as Tatiana said, that is very rewarding, but it is a key part of this practice area. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. It was a fascinating retelling of your career journey, and thank you very much for sharing it with us. And again, we'll come to questions at the end, so if you have any for Nina, please do add them to the Q&A box. Next up, I think we should have Monica.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be with you all today and meeting some colleagues for the first time over Zoom. My path has been a bit different from my colleagues. First of all, why did I come to international law? I didn't grow up in the UK. I was born in Peru. I grew up during a dictatorship, and I studied law throughout the Civil War. So I guess that kind of set very important, it was the context for me to realize that I wanted to do something with the law. I wanted to be a lawyer. I think by 12, I already was quite clear that that's what I wanted to be. And I came to the law wanting to make a difference. Obviously, in that context, I believe on the importance of justice and the importance of the rule of law. Now, I came to England as a refugee, so my starting point in England was, I would say, very opposite from anything that you may have possibly had in front of you when you wanted to start practicing law. But the advantage was that I was clearly interested in international law. I had been quite good in public international law when I did my law degree. And so I enrolled and did an LLM immediately, as soon as I could. And it was the right decision for me. I was quite lucky at the time because I came to the LSE when there was an interesting moment. We had Rosalie Higgins, who had been just appointed to the ICJ. And I studied with all the material that she had put together for the International Protection of Human Rights law course, which was great. And I had these memories of taking the number 13 from my flat to the LSE and reading all these judgments. And I was just absolutely marveled by all these very interesting different notions that I was coming to understand when I was studying the LLM. But I had these experiences that you've been talking about first, meaning that you had to go somewhere to get that being in touch with the real world of human rights and violations and what is going on in the ground. But I had actually been shaped by these experiences, and I think that gave me an amazing insight into things, although I was not yet aware to what extent so. Because the first, well, perhaps my first years were focusing on preparing myself. I learned international law as much as I could. But I think I use a lot my own experiences to understand international law from a point of view that perhaps was somehow different from the average person practicing international law here. And I remember this discussion I had with a coming professor who was Sir Christopher Greenwood at the LSE, where we were discussing human rights law and international humanitarian law. And I was one of the first persons, I think, that throw in front of him, well, look, these are deeply connected. These are two areas that are deeply connected. because they ultimately protect human dignity. And I knew that because of where I was coming from. And we had a very interesting discussion that somehow sealed, in a way, I think, what I did next, because I spent a couple of years teaching at LSE, which was a time that prepared me. It was some kind of a foundational moment. I learned all the areas of public international law. I didn't focus just on human rights. I'm quite proud of that because I see the field not in a fragmented way, but I believe that the connections are extremely important. Although I had obviously at the time a big interest on international criminal law. My path from teaching was trying to acquire choreal experience. I was interested in how you adjudicate and deliver international justice. And at the time, there were universities that had somehow almost monopoly to, for example, placing students at the ICJ, or not the students, but rather graduates. And that was NYU, the first university that did that. So it appeared that there were obviously certain universities or people coming from certain universities that had the possibility to acquire experience in international courts in a manner that perhaps others couldn't. But, you know, I never really thought about those as a kind of impediments or some kind of, you know, barriers. I just thought, well, here I am. I have studied law for a number of years. I feel pretty much on top of it. And I like to use this and to serve, if you want, justice. So, so I just applied. So I just made my applications, and I guess I hope for the best. And it did work. And I got this experience of going to The Hague. The first big case I did in The Hague first was at the ICTY. I worked on the topic of command responsibility, which was at the time a huge subject. There hasn't been, the case I worked on was one of the first ones that dealt with all the, perhaps the tricky questions on command responsibility. And I spent my time really diving into these issues, and that was extremely formative at the time. And also working with the judges. I think that was very important for me to learn how a judge thinks and how a judge approaches a case, and drafting, if you want, you know, assisting judges to draft a judgment was extremely important, because it helped me to understand how to focus, what is important, what is not important. And the responsibility also in doing so. When I was at the ICJ, I worked mainly on the genocide case between Bosnia and ex-Yugoslavia. And that was a time where basically I realized that after doing that and perhaps doing a little bit more of postgraduate studies, I realized that I didn't want to spend my time only working on perhaps cases that have, they were receiving already quite a lot of attention. I felt that, for example, cases from Latin America, and you know, at some point I stopped and I was reflecting about that. There were civil wars that nobody cared about. And I thought a lot about countries like Guatemala, where you know, entire cities had been wiped out, and you didn't have just lists of, you know, individuals. You went to Wikipedia and you saw lists of villages, one after the other, and that had received very little attention. Or a massacre like El Mozote in El Salvador, which I visited, and you know, where they killed 1,000 people in one day, including children, 101. So these kind of things were important for my own considerations as to what to do. And then life kind of threw something at me, which was that I had denounced a specific massacre that took place in Peru. And I was hoping that a big NGO could take it, but this NGO actually declined. And that put me in a kind of difficult position, because the this was not easy. It was a crimes against humanity case. It was a very hot case, very unpopular, and was massive. So for the investigation of a case like that at the ICTY, you would have at least 10 legal officers working on something like that. But it would appear that this case wouldn't have this type of resources. So when I was turned down, I had to make a decision. And the decision was, I am going to represent the case. To cut a long story short, I won the case. It took me a great effort, and it was a kind of formative case because it taught me that I was a litigator. The case ended up with the order of a human rights court to prosecute a former head of a state. It was the first also case in the Americas where sexual violence was acknowledged to be, well, including rape, a violation of the American Convention on Human Rights, and really feminized the entire interpretation of the American Convention on Human Rights. And from that point on, I felt that if I had done that in the circumstances I had to win that case, I could do anything. So eventually I came to the bar. I had already had few years of experience litigating cases and winning cases. So my path somehow was a little bit different from you all. The bar feels far easier than what this experience was. And I think what I like about my practice is that I work with a diversity of issues. I also enjoy the fact that I try to have experience in different positions. I have acted for estates. I have acted for victims. I work not only in the area of human rights law, but also areas that are mixed with other areas of general law. And that makes my life, I guess, very rewarding. I just find, you know, if we go back to the kind of question that Tatiana just posed, I would say that what I'm driven by is remedies. I'm not too worried about what do you call that area of law, because in my experience, you can find ingenious ways of providing remedies for your clients. So what I have is the ability to a broad knowledge of international law that can allow me to see what actually may work to resolve a particular issue. And that can be of different nature. So that is, I guess, something that I would leave with you, that is to be flexible when looking at what may be your future in the law. I would also advise as a tip that you should take this. If we talk about human rights law, I feel rather uncomfortable when we talk about that in terms of career. And the reason is because when I was at the diplomatic conference that was just mentioned as legal advisor, you know, it was a great opportunity. Everybody was dying to be there. But sometimes we were talking about genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes. And some of my colleagues that were coming from different places in Europe were seeing that as a career opportunity. And that really makes me feel very uncomfortable. So I would say that look at it rather as an area of law that you want to practice in. And try to use perhaps your own connections with the law, with your own life connections as a way to start. Because in my case, that was extremely important. I think that I became the lawyer that I am now thanks to those experiences. So look at your own background, your family background, the kind of things that make you tick. So I'll leave you with these thoughts and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Monica. That's an excellent place to leave it. Thank you very much for your contribution. And finally, and as I said, very much last but not least, we're joined by Rupert, who is going to say a few words about his career path.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me. So my career started again, like Tatiana. I didn't study law. I studied English literature and history of art, and then didn't know what to do, so did the conversion course, but that's not what I should be telling you all. But during my studies, I did an internship at the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, and as part of that, I assisted on a trial in Pell City, Alabama, of a man called Corey Smith, who was just turned 18 at the time that he killed his girlfriend, and his two co-defendants were 16 and 15. They pleaded out on the morning of the trial to life without parole for capital murder to avoid the death sentence, and gave evidence, state's evidence, against Corey Smith, who was then, after the end of the trial, sentenced to death. That galvanized me to go into a career in human rights, and I've been observing death penalty cases in the United States ever since. I also did a Pegasus Scholarship, for those of you who are looking at things from the bar perspective, at the European Court of Human Rights during my studies, and that was incredibly useful, as 3 months spent working in the registry of the court gives you more experience than a master's in human rights law. You're there looking up the issues, helping write the judgments, doing the research, speaking to the judgments, living and breathing human rights law all the time. So that's a really good opportunity to learn about it. I then did get pupillage. I think it took me a couple of goes, and then got tenancy, and I spent about 9 or 10 years practicing at the bar in total. I did a mixture of criminal law, family law, a bit of public law, some human rights law. At the same time, I did voluntary work for the Bar Human Rights Committee, where I was on the executive committee, and that meant doing some trial observations. I wrote a report on Diego Garcia and the torture that had gone on there. I did other missions, as well as just engaging with the issues on a day-to-day basis. That was incredibly good experience. I also did voluntary work with Amnesty International, writing a report for them on the death penalty in Zambia, doing a trial observation for the Brayton 7 in Jamaica, and helped set up an NGO called Amicus that was about organising British lawyers to go and assist with US death penalty trials, and essentially we persuaded the Foreign Office to give us about £300,000, I think, to send British lawyers on those placements. So that was all while I was practicing at the bar. So while I was primarily practicing, almost exclusively practicing in domestic, criminal, family law, etc., at the same time I was dealing with international law in lots of different ways. After practicing domestically, I then spent about 5 years working in international criminal law. That started with working as the defense advisor at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and then I went to set up the defense office at the Court of Bosnia-Herzegovina in Sarajevo, which was the domestic war crimes trial that was the follow-up to the ICTY. And then after that, I got a job with the United Nations as the principal defender of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Cambodia. Now, those jobs were all very legal, in that I had fun experiences at Sierra Leone, such as arguing that a certain international judge should be dismissed for actual bias, which was a very interesting legal exercise. I made extraordinary arguments about genocide, the definition of genocide in Cambodia, but I was also an administrator and a manager, in that I was managing fairly heavy budgets to pay the legal fees, doing training of judges and lawyers, doing all the other things around that. So it wasn't just a legal element, it required other skills as well. I did that for about 5 years. And then I moved across into pure human rights law, where I spent 10 years working mainly in New York for the Open Society Justice Initiative. And that was hardcore litigation, bringing legal claims in more than 70 countries around the world on a huge issue, a number of issues, cases such as Khalid al-Masri on CIA rendition, cases such as Sergei Magnitsky on the torture and ultimate killing of a whistleblower, and a fascinating experience. And there aren't that many straight litigation organizations. Redress is one of them, OSJI, Open Society Justice Initiative, is another, ERAC here in London is another. There are a handful of them, but those where you do pure law inside an NGO aren't that frequent, but there are some out there. And then 2.5 years ago, I became the director of redress. Now, again, you need a lot of legal skills, but you need to have lots of other skills. An example of that, I think day 2 in my job, my head of communications came to me and said, can you do a live interview on the BBC about whether or not our client has been tortured? And the only answer to that is to say, yes, I can do that. But you then have to bring in your legal experience, all the other things you've learned over that career to be able to do that and take that role. And running an NGO, a human rights NGO, is a peculiar role, because you need to have extraordinary legal expertise that you've built up. You need to have really good networks, but lots of other skills that you may not have otherwise. So my top 10 tips. I think I've only got 9, but whatever, we'll run with it, of how you should do this. The first one, most of them have already been said, so I'll just reiterate them for emphasis. The zigzag, there is no one route. I think Tatiana mentioned this one. There's no one thing, I'm going to do this and then this and then this and then this. It doesn't work like that. You go from one to the other like that. And so don't expect your one career to work. I didn't expect I would end up running an NGO. I think I probably thought I was going to do international criminal law, but then moved away from that after a while. So be ready to zigzag if needs be. Masters, I think you do now need one. When I did it, I didn't do an LLM, but when we recruit anyone for any job, you've got to have an LLM just to get through to the first interview, because when there are so many applications, you almost certainly have to do it. Having said that, qualifying as the bar is, I know this because I had to do it, is the degree of utter barrister. If you apply to the United Nations, you must have a higher degree. The degree of utter barrister counts as a higher degree. I can promise you, because I had to confirm that with the United Nations for the Cambodia job. So that does work, but general terms, I'd say do an LLM. Generalist or specialist, that'll decide, that's up to you. Some of them are super specialists, just international criminal law. The generalist ones, you don't really do enough on certain issues. It may depend on the existing experience you have. Internships. I think while a student, they're a great thing to do. 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks at Redress, you will learn, to be honest, more about human rights law than you will in many master's courses, because you're doing it 35 hours a week and you're doing it in practice. So those are incredibly useful to build up that experience. Skills. Now this one not everyone likes. I think to have a successful career, or the most opportunities available to you, you need to practice your career, practice your profession at some point. Like a doctor, you qualify, you then need to practice to learn those skills. Particularly the skills at the bar are learning how to do client work, whether it's criminal, family, asylum, doesn't matter what kind of client, but knowing how to engage with anyone, no matter what situation they're in. Public speaking, obviously, written appeals, critical stuff for international human rights law, the state of mind of the professional ethic that applies, and understanding ethics as well, and getting fast. Particular quality, I think, barristers have, and all the ones I've ever recruited have, is they're extremely fast. And so often you hear that at the European Court of Human Rights, they love the way that barristers could synthesize, summarize what's going on. So that's a really useful thing to think about. You can have a career in human rights as with just a law degree, as you might call a jurist. That in some jurisdictions they describe it as that, but I think it limits your opportunities. Having the practice means you can train people. It's very difficult to train lawyers in Bosnia on how to do trial advocacy if you've never done a jury trial yourself. So I think that's really helpful, and I would emphasize that. Pro bono work, I've mentioned that. I think that's something you can definitely do while you're at the bar and while practicing. The ways I described already. Other ones, if you're a bit more senior, not particularly, is as a trustee. Lots of NGOs are looking for lawyers to act as trustees. That's a really good way to understand how NGOs work. Field work, that's a rather patronizing phrase for it, but you've heard that most people have described doing work not in London, not in the United Kingdom, but in Malawi or in Bosnia, or with the minister in Albania, wherever it was. So though that kind of practical experience on the ground is invaluable, because certainly within UN careers and other careers, if you've never done that, you will hit a ceiling. Connections, it's really worth getting to know people. Not everything is advertised. Certainly short-term consultancies are not advertised. And so there are opportunities that are there because you are known and because you've got a good reputation. So combined with connections, I'd say reputation. For the NGO route, you need other skills. You need to know how to train people. You need to understand finance, management, leadership, strategy, fundraising. Think about how you could pick those skills up earlier in your career, possibly as a trustee, so that you have them later in your career. And then the last one, this is a boring one to finish on, but you need it, languages. I think if you don't, it came up, someone mentioned it, if you don't have French, you cannot apply to quite a chunk of jobs still, certainly for the United Nations. I just got through, I can't claim it was fluent, Nina, but I got far enough because the job in Cambodia as Khmer Rouge principal defender required working in French with some fairly grand French lawyers. And I had just enough to get through for that. But if you don't have it at all, then you simply can't apply for certain jobs. So it's British barristers don't necessarily want to hear that one, but I'm afraid it's really worth investing in that while you have the time. So I think that was 9, but that's close enough. Hopefully those are useful.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Really useful, and actually some of what you've touched on very aptly reflects what we're seeing in our Q&A box. So there may be a little bit of overlap, but thank you all hugely for your contributions, and I can see that it's been well received just by the number of questions that we've got. So I might try just to accumulate some of these questions now and put them to the panel as a whole. The first one, nobody will be surprised to know, relates to experience. So how do you gain experience in international human rights? So there are two types of questions. One is, how do we gain it at the moment? In COVID-19, we can't go on the field. Our experiences are more limited. And secondly, what type of experience do I need to do a domestic pupillage? So any specific tips or specific organisations? And Rupert, somebody has asked, when are Redress taking their intern? So I'll let you do a pitch about that if you would like to as well.
Sure. Well, shall I talk about that one? Internships these days are pretty well professionalised in that there's an application process, and almost every NGO that I know of will have an application form and certain times to do it. That would more be for students. I mean, if anyone was considering doing it as a volunteer, as a qualified lawyer, so either a pro bono lawyer, a solicitor of the law firm, or someone who is either a pupil or is qualified, that might be considered differently. And so therefore you might need to approach the NGO directly and see what they would find useful. But certainly for those who are still students looking to do an internship, certainly it's the same for Redress. It's a competitive application process. Some of them are funded, NGOs such as Justice, which does more legal human rights work in the UK. They have fully funded ones. Some of them haven't quite managed that yet, so there's expenses, etc. paid. But yeah, so look around. They all do them now for students in a very structured way. As I say, for lawyers, you need to look at it slightly differently and potentially make a direct approach.
Thank you, Rupert. Any of the other panelists want to come in on work experience in the current climate, and any specific organisations that you've got experience with that you would recommend? Hi, Tatiana.
Hi. Well, just to add to that, I do know that a lot of universities, I'm sure the students who are attending know as well, have legal pro bono units, and you can do a lot of that actually remotely online, depending on the issues, of course, but advisory work or report writing using open source materials for evidence you can do. And in recent projects with the Bar Human Rights Committee, actually, we reached out to our membership for assistance in report writing. It's fairly academic work in the sense of reading through things and drafting, but it's not academic in the sense that it is used for a report to present, say, to government ministers, and you get your name on it and you get to contribute to these issues. So that I think in these sort of strange, straitened times, you can get experience by volunteering your time in things like this. So look at the pro bono units in your universities, look to the Bar Human Rights Committee or other organisations, similar organisations that do reach out to membership for assistance in this kind of thing.
Thank you, Tatiana. Monica.
I say that there is always ways of getting involved with human rights without leaving the UK. Particularly, I would think that perhaps there is something that we haven't mentioned, which is, I believe that it's quite important to accumulate maturity to deal with human rights as, practice, because sometimes very young people imagine that this is a very exciting area, but you actually need to be able to understand. And someone mentioned about being able to speak to potential clients or victims, etc. That's not going to come out of nowhere. I think to have the sensibility of how to work in certain type of cases needs to build something. And for that, you need to read, you need to be exposed to develop empathy, to be exposed to perhaps, projects where already kind of teaches you how to approach these kind of human stories. So I would say, if you want to work in the area of human rights, well, try then to to develop areas of interest in your life that can take you there. Because I find that it's very artificial otherwise. You know, I'm here in this very comfortable position. I am studying law and neurodesign. I want to be there in that field kind of job. So don't have that kind of approach. You can always start doing very interesting things just right where you are. And also the point that was raised on language is absolutely true. So maybe you can use your time to develop those skills. I speak Spanish, French, and English. French was quite useful, I think, to get my experiences, and Spanish for working in a number of other jurisdictions. So I guess that's something you can also try to develop whilst you can.
Thank you, Monica. And I think the next batch of questions that we have really relates, I think, to those panelists who've balanced both academia and practice. And the question, both from anonymous attendees, is to Tatiana and Monica. Having experienced both academia and practice, would you say to an undergraduate interested in both fields to first develop a career in academia and then go to the bar, or vice versa? And a related question from somebody who has built up quite a decent academic and international practice, and including writing and speaking. And she wants to know, should I build on that experience and go for an associate tenancy, or should I keep trying for pupillage, even though there have been a couple of knocks over the last few years? So questions really about balancing those two professions and which you think should come first.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I don't think there's any right way. The reason I did my rather, as Rupert said, zigzag path was very much my own personal life circumstances. And I think if I was an undergraduate and I was certain about what I wanted to do, and what I wanted to do was practice at the bar, I would go for practicing at the bar. If I was an undergraduate and I was really, as I came to realise, really interested in the law and developing a real in-depth understanding of the law, and I wasn't quite certain about which area I wanted to be in, academia or the bar, I would go to academia first. It is an incredible time being in academia. It's a privilege, and if you can afford to do that privilege, it's wonderful. And there are obviously the funding available to do a PhD. I'm not saying a PhD is essential, but it's a very different career path to being at the bar. So it's not a very helpful answer, probably. It very much depends on what you want to do. And there are people like, you see, like James Crawford, Professor James Crawford, and Philippe Sands, who are academics and practitioners. And you look at them and you think, God, you've got the ultimate life. But there are very few people that can manage both, and they're often very senior. So yeah, I don't know how helpful that was. I would say if you're an undergraduate and well, academia first, but if you really want to practice, just come to the bar. It's hard, but it can be brilliant. And there's always the opportunity to step back into academia should you wish to.
Thanks, Tatiana. I think that was also Nina's advice, not from the academic perspective, but having worked in the city first as well, to come to the bar is the message from the event. Monica, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Well, I think that nothing stops you to developing ways of acquiring knowledge. If you are right now in that kind of moment, I knew quite early that I wanted to practice. I knew quite early that I wanted to be a litigator, but the time spent just learning and teaching. So like that, teaching really is learning, because you cannot understand a judgment properly until you have to explain it in a very simple way to students that make the most fabulous questions, because they are very obvious, but then is not so obvious. I'd say that it's always, it will always build, it will always give you possibilities if you accumulate some level of knowledge. But I think that you by now must know what you are good at. And I mean, early in my own development, I realized I wanted to be a litigator. I was skilled, doing litigation. But it's something that you will have to discover as things go. Do I want to be just teaching, or do I feel like I want to be being part of delivering specific, I don't know, justice to a specific case? How do you see yourself? And if you don't know, well, do some kind of mini pupillages to find out whether you feel comfortable being in practice, or perhaps that's not for you. So unless you try, you won't know. So that's a good, perhaps that's an advice that I would give you.
So I didn't answer the question about from the person who was asking, who's been trying for pupillage and whether or not she should continue. Just say trying to get pupillage is really hard, and I know a few people who are incredibly well skilled and intelligent and gifted, and have found it very difficult to get pupillage. I would say still keep plugging away and at it if that's what you really want to do. But if there are opportunities that you're seeing and you can make a career at the same time in another way, it doesn't mean that you are blocking off the opportunity to practice in human rights in some way or another. I don't know, different chambers have different attitudes towards associate tenants. In my chambers, associate tenants are qualified lawyers, and then we have academic tenants, and there are ways to be involved as academic advisors and stuff with certain chambers. But I know it can be quite a demoralising process, and you have my sympathies. We've all been there, and it's a horrible time.
Thank you, Tatiana. And there have been a couple of questions exactly on that point, actually, just about pursuing pupillage and how long to keep going with it. And there's a question here from Emily, which I think is interesting. And Nina, I might start with you if you don't mind. Would you recommend any particular practice areas to start working in that would transition well into international human rights or public international law? And I take that to mean any particular domestic practice areas.
I don't know what's happening these days, but when I did it, I don't know if Liberty's still taking volunteers, but for example, I volunteered on their advice line. I know that Amnesty, in terms of these are the organisations, in terms of areas, if you can find domestic NGOs that do work based in foreign countries, then I would do that. Your contacts are here. There are a number of them. Rupert's probably better versed on the specific ones that one should go to. But I also echo what Monica said. The ability to speak to a client is key. So I did advice, as I said, at Waterloo Legal Advice Centre. So straightforward. I know it sounds a bit random, but legal advice clinics where people are coming through the door with their Sainsbury's bags full of documents of their housing, their immigration, their criminal, all these different issues. They put them on the table and they say, well, help, I think I've got a case. That was probably the making of me, and to some extent, because I learned how to interact with people of all different nationalities, of different backgrounds, who felt that they had been wronged. And that is, in essence, what working in this field is. And it's your ability to communicate with those people and to secure their trust that will enable you to ultimately be an effective advocate in this sphere. And my work now on torture, where I sit with victims of torture for 3, 4, 5 days and document their stories, draws heavily on that experience I had at the beginning of my career. So I would go for all the big NGOs, Rupert can advise, but I would also look at legal advice clinics in your area. And I know that a lot of them are now looking at whether or not they should have Zoom sessions rather than meeting in person. And things like that are still happening, and they're in our communities, and you don't have to have money to get on a plane to do them. So I think these are all very tangible skills that would be useful to acquire if this is an area that you're serious about going into.
I'd reiterate that. I mean, I think that skills point does come across all the time. And it's also Monica's sort of empathy and state of mind point. I always got slightly irritated with people who would say, oh, I want to defend someone charged with crimes against humanity. And I said, well, have you defended someone charged with shoplifting? because until you've done the one, you shouldn't really progress to the other. And Monica's point of empathy, you also have to learn how to deal with some of the stuff you're dealing with. And so starting with a domestic career, where particularly in crime, where you learn and read about some of the terrible things that may have happened before you build up to the really bad stuff, is important. And there was one of the questions that sort of comes up with this was about the cost of all of this, because we keep saying, do some voluntary work, do some pro bono. But the things Nina was talking about, you can do in a few hours, 1 or 2 evenings a week. You can do at weekends. So you can do them, or if you're with the Bar Human Rights Committee, you can do it while you're earning some money, depending on how much you're being paid. So, I mean, it is possible to do it, even though you're not being paid for it, because you essentially balance your paid work with the unpaid work, as a few of us have mentioned. And so I think that that's an important way to look at how to get that experience when you may not have the funds to support it, to work full-time for no money.
Thank you all. We've got a couple of questions, as well as questions from students. We've got a couple from practitioners as well, and I'll turn to those now. One is from Parissa, who says, are there any tips for those based outside London and not in a set well known for human rights and international law as to how to build their practice and their profile in these areas? So I don't know who wants to take that first. Monica has a hand up.
Well, I think what I may say may be useful to answer this question, and it kind of follows up from what was asked before. There are some areas that are not called human rights, but it is so much about human rights. And I discovered that actually when I came to the bar, because one of the first cases I was involved in when I came to the bar was tort law cases. And I think that that is, you know, a huge interesting area that you can do that, you know, anywhere here in the UK. So you can try to seek experiences of that sort that are right now. For example, I think one of the biggest cases on torts is being litigated in Manchester. It's not even in London, you know, and so it is quite interesting how it's actually not just in London right now, but you are having these type of big cases, you know, around the UK. So that would be one piece of advice, that look broader. I mean, don't just look at those type of cases that you imagine this is about human rights. It may be that it is far more interesting, and you may actually pick up skills that you may want to pursue later once you are practicing in your own right. The other thing is that, you know, look at experiences of some people that managed to do amazing things. Say like Judge Ginsburg is a big sort of inspiration, because for her it was very hard to actually find a beginning. So where to begin? You know, she studied law and she couldn't get a job as a lawyer, although she had studied Harvard and Columbia. And the way she did it is she went to academia. And then started running a clinic, and eventually she ended up pleading some of the most important cases on gender justice in the US before the Supreme Court. So what I mean is that what I said about flexibility is quite crucial. You know, first of all, you have to develop as a person. What is your interest? Where would you like to be going? So because that is going to take you to the right place.
Thank you, Monica. Would anybody else like to come in on that question about gaining experience and developing your practice, perhaps if you don't start out in this area of law, but you're already at the bar?
I just wanted to add to, I think there was a question initially about somebody was in a set outside of London. I was just going to say, I'm at a set that doesn't specialise in international law, and so I just created an international group that now I lead. And then I reached out to a friend at the time that the Rohingya case was beginning at the ICC, who I knew worked in Bangkok. I think I was at Westminster Magistrates Court and having a bad day prosecuting some extradition, and I was like, my God, I need to do something else. And I said, you know, do you know anybody that needs assistance? And she said, actually, I'm right now in a room with Bangladeshi CSOs, and they are interested in seeing if their voice can be heard in these proceedings. So then I took that back to this fledgling group I'd created, and even though people didn't have experience in this area, they were up for it. And we helped the Bangladeshi NGOs to write the brief. So I think to some extent, as long as you have the experience or you're starting to get it through the ways that we've mentioned, you can then be the spearhead of it. And I would say reach out to other practitioners in other sets that you've heard of or you looked at. And generally speaking, they're quite a friendly group. And then I think see if you can help them, or if there's any case that they have that maybe you can assist with. You know, I think it's just putting yourself out there to see and seeing who needs assistance. So even if you're not at a set that specializes in that, you could develop that. And I also do know from my time in international criminal law, there were loads of barristers who were from random sets that had no experience in this area. And then a large number of people like me who were corporate litigators. Most of my American friends had come from Sherman and Sterling, you know, these big American law firms, and decided to change course. So I think, having been someone that's done it, is totally possible, but it's about, like everybody has said, deciding what you want, reaching out to the people who do it already, and seeing who's got time for a cup of coffee. Loads of people won't reply, but then one will, and they'll be that's the only person that you need.
Thank you, Nina. Tatiana or Rupert, there's no pressure, but if there was anything you were jumping up and down wanting to mention.
On that, well, on that one, and on one of the other questions I might just jump in on because it was an interesting one. But on that one, yes, for example, Judge Morrison at the International Criminal Court practiced on the Midland Circuit, not in London as far as I'm aware, not much. And so you can certainly make a very illustrious career in international law without having to have those London connections. One question that's out there which we possibly missed, and it's very relevant for, I think, the bar, the British bar or the English bar, is someone said, well, what are you lot all doing going around the world telling people how to do it when you're not qualified in those jurisdictions? And I think that's really important. I mean, 30 years ago, there was, well, possibly slightly less than that, there was the habit of silks getting rights of audience in foreign courts and basically telling the locals how to do it. Things have moved on quite a lot since then, and I think what we probably would have all made clear is that in almost all the engagements we do, we are working with a national partner, whether it's a national lawyer or a national NGO. And so what we're doing is bringing our particular legal expertise and legal skills to that national NGO to help with them, because there is a real risk if you're not careful of the flying lawyer coming in and solving the problem and then flying out again the next day. And it is important when developing the more modern style of international human rights law careers to avoid that impression. So it was an interesting question someone raised, which I thought I'd just respond to.
No, thank you, Rupert. And yes, I see that question. It's important for this person to practice international law in a respectful manner. Do you have any reflections on this aspect of your work? And I can just say from the Bar Human Rights Committee perspective that, as Rupert says, we're very alert to that issue and very careful to work with local partners as much as possible to avoid some of the difficulties that have been referred to. Would anybody else like to comment on that point? No. Okay, one question for Monica in terms of coming to international law to the bar not from an English background. How do you leverage your personal experience and your different cultural experience in that process? Oh, I think you're still on mute, Monica.
Sorry. I was quite experienced already in international law when I came to the bar, and I guess that facilitated the process of getting used to the public international law bar. And someone mentioned before that it's a very small bar, and it's true. I knew well the work of all the public international law specialists around, and that in a way made me feel a little bit more at home. But obviously the bar is got its specificities, I would say. I found it very refreshing at the beginning because the first file I was ever given, I remember it was a commercial law case, and when I got it, I felt great. There was no blood in any of the pages, and all the cases that I had worked on were just so serious and stuff that it felt really good. And the other thing that I like was that the commercial law actually works so perfectly. You know, you had this provisional, I mean, in international law, it was like a fight to get, you know, a judgment being complied with, your provisional measures to be respected. And then you had this fantastic world where everything was so speedy, and you had the procedure that actually, you know, was working very well. So that was great. But I think I felt that I was also adding quite new skills to what I had already learned before, and made me more of a full lawyer. I also spent a couple of, well, now I wouldn't say a couple of months. I did spend some months working for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which was a tremendous, it was a great experience. And it made me also look at things from a different perspective, which was great. Now, the range of work also I was exposed to was quite enriching. And it was kind of experience where I could use my skills throughout, basically every single area of the law. And that was very invigorating. So yes, you will probably, you won't see, you know, very often that there are foreign practitioners that eventually are called to the bar and are practicing at the English bar, but you will find some. I am quite happy at the bar. I am doing work that matters. This year I was nominated for a Barrister of the Year, which was a big surprise, and I never thought, you know, something like that could happen in a period of 5 years of being at the bar. But I think it was my sense of using my time also on cases that I feel good about. We have something great though at the bar, which was new for me, and that had, I think it put me on a different also, perhaps approach, a different approach to what an advocate does, and this is the cap rank rule. And I think it is a very important rule that the bar has and protects lawyers. And also it helps you to understand that you not necessarily are in the position of the judge, but you are in the position of the facilitator to bring a perspective, a point of view at the table, and you know, someone else is actually deciding on the case. That I think is quite enriching, because we shouldn't forget ever that what we are defending in a way is the rule of law. So everybody to have the opportunity to bring, you know, a side in a story. So these are quite enriching aspects. I think the bar can have a great provide greater skills to the world, and I rescue that from the last years that I've been a part of the bar. So yes, you may find some cultural specificities, but I think it is when you actually are clear as to what you want to do at the bar, I think it is something that I would advise. You know, it's a great place to be.
Great, okay, and I think possibly our last question now, we've touched on the bar and academia, and it's a final question about the UN system, and I think many of you will be able to speak about this. And my experience with UN jobs searches indicates that I need contacts and not just experience. What has your experience been, and are there any tips in relation to navigating the UN system? I don't know who would like to go first with that one.
I think, sadly, that is fairly correct. I'm perhaps an exception to the rule in that I sent so many applications, then one of them hit, and I got it. So I think you can break in without knowing anybody, and that was certainly my experience. And it goes back to this internship point, which I hate, because I think it's totally incorrect that the UN has unpaid interns, but I did find that many American colleagues of mine had all done internships in the summer funded by their law schools. So I think there is inequality, and it is very difficult. My own experience is simply that I kept trying and I eventually got there. The other option that might be a possibility is UN volunteers, because I applied there also and got a position there, but I didn't take it. But that seemed to me a slightly easier route in if you don't know anybody. And then once you get on the ground, you can make contacts and you can go from there. Once you're in, you're in. But the only advice I could say is just keep applying and make sure you have the languages. You must have French. And so I did courses afterwards to try to get my French up and then got in, and part of my interview was in French. So don't underestimate that.
And I'd say, I mean, I think a UN panel would be quite interested. So if you're looking at a P3 position or something, probably in the field, I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't apply for a headquarters job. You're just not going to get it, because the competition for them will be several thousand for each position. And they do have geographical quotas for those HQ positions. So it may well be that as a UK national would probably, I don't know the figures at the moment, but be cautious of that. Certainly New York, incredibly difficult. Geneva jobs, OHCHR, the Office for Human Rights, does have quite a lot of P2 and P3 jobs, so for the early stages in your career. And for example, if you want a job in the petitions team, who deal with the petitions before the UN treaty bodies, they'd be very excited to have someone with good experience of written work in English and potentially in French as well. So I think all that we've said does apply to that. All the skills, building that experience that we've talked about would get you in for potential Geneva job writing that. But then again, for a field position, so if there's a P3 position in the field where they're going to want practical experience, you will have had to develop that some experience to talk about how to run projects, because often those aren't going to be pure law. They're going to be delivering projects or whatever it may be, training. So all the discussions we've had about broadening your skills base, I think those are really important if you're applying for a human rights officer P3 position in the UN. And Nina's point about languages is absolutely right. You've almost certainly got to have French for it.
Thank you both. That's our final question of the evening. I don't know if Tatiana or Monica had anything that they wanted to say on that point about the UN system, or if you think Nina and Rupert have covered it all.
I'll say something. May I? Yes?
Yes, of course.
The UN may not be the only place where you could try. I mean, there is certainly regional organs, and I think you should also consider those. I didn't have any contact. I mean, I told you where I came from. I was a refugee. I mean, I didn't know anyone that could actually you know, I had a history, you know, like common schooling or university. So you have to try. And I think that the no's that you receive shouldn't stop you from pursuing an interest that is genuine. And so if you are interested, just, you know, continue and try and go to those talks and all presentations that you are interested on, and try to become a member of associations that are also working in these areas. So I think it's a beginning, and then you probably will find out about opportunities. So that is quite important, that you have to be always, you know, with seeking information. I think is rather what I would advise you to do, and then try.
And I just slip into that one is interview practice too, because a pupillage interview is not the same as the real world. They're testing completely different skills. And so if you're going to apply for one of those other institutions that Monica has mentioned, there are a lot out there, not just the UN, you've got to learn how to do an organizational interview that is not the same as a pupillage interview.
I would say interview practice for pupillage interviews as well.
As well.
A major mistake of mine.
Yeah. Yes.
Never took it, but I thought I knew how to do an interview. I really didn't.
Well, somebody on the panel has an interview tomorrow, so we can't unfortunately answer too many questions, but we wish you the very best of luck. And unfortunately, that really concludes our event this evening. We've had a lot of questions. We haven't been able to answer all of them, but hopefully we've answered the main ones, and I'm sure that I speak for everyone when I say I think the advice has been really interesting, informative, honest, and really, really helpful, and actually a little bit inspiring. So hopefully we're all leaving with a spring in our step in terms of the future options open to all of us. And I think it's been a really important discussion to have, not only to be reminded of the variety and the satisfaction in this area of law, but also about how important it is. And what struck me as each of you was speaking, and we were looking at it from a career point of view, but standing back from that, the work is obviously so important and is really making a big difference to individual lives, as Nina says, in terms of somebody bringing in a Sainsbury's bag full of documents, and also on a larger scale as well. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. I just want to finish really with a bit of a message to those in the seminar who are either members of the bar or who plan to become members of the bar. They're currently studying for it. Just to invite you to join us, to join the Bar Human Rights Committee. It's one way which Rupert has said and Tatiana has said, and I would also say is a really good way to start to learn and develop your skills in this area, and also make a really valuable contribution to important issues. So I also joined it when I was really quite a new tenant, and it's been a really wonderful way for me to develop this area of my practice, and as I've said, work in this area. And more importantly, I would also ask you to join us, just because, as I've said at the beginning, not only for your own interests and developments, but as a sign of solidarity really for the international human rights movement at this time. We've mentioned at the beginning the challenges that it's facing, and certainly our experience is that your views, the views of the bar, do count, do make a difference when we're putting them forward to government and institutions around the world, and in particular support other bar associations. And so we do need all of you at the Future of the Bar to join us, to continue to support us. We do have projects that will be ongoing, and if you join as a member, we'll receive our newsletter and we'll receive those opportunities. So please do think about joining us, and the details are all on our website, and we can provide them as well if you've got any particular questions. But thank you all very much for joining us, and huge thanks to our brilliant panel members for giving up their time and speaking to us so brilliantly about their careers. And I think that probably concludes the evening, but thank you all very, very much.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.